Welcome back. This is week 3, lecture 2, The Myth of Rome. Now, we left off last lecture with the Greek inheritance, making the connection via Virgil of I fear the Greeks even bearing gifts. And Rome, in so many ways, was the inheritor of Greece and Alexander's empire. And when Alexander died in 323 BCE, Rome was beginning to expand. Rome was a small city in its origins, which I'll be talking a bit more about, but it was beginning to expand in the Italian peninsula. And it was to keep on expanding for the next, 800 years approximately, until it reached the extent of its empire. Now, we'll be talking about empire and what is an empire. I mentioned in the early lecture on the emergence of civilization, that part of that was the emergence of empire. The first empire, perhaps in the history of the world, was that of Sargon. And one of the problems with defining the earliest empire, because they also pointed to the Auric expansion in ancient Mesopotamia as perhaps an empire, is how we define empire. Empire can be defined in two ways, and I'll be talking a little bit more about this later on in this lecture. The first way of defining empire is the extent of hegemonic control. Now, hegemony is a term I used before, and hegemonic is just the adjective of hegemony, means control, authority over. And so in terms of extent of hegemony, once a political entity establishes control and authority over a larger territory than its own political boundaries, it becomes an empire, or can be seen as an empire. The extent to which, as I kind of pointed out or tried to with the Auric expansion way back when, was an economic hegemony. With Sargon, we also have the political hegemony as part of that as well. Alexander, too, established hegemonic control over a very large empire, but what he was not able to conquer was India. Now, Rome has had an overwhelming impact on the development of the West, keeping that in mind, too, in terms of what the West means and the relative aspects of it. And part of this is not only the extent of its empire in terms of hegemonic control, but also in terms of the form of government, because that's the other definition of empire. An empire can be a form of government. And I'll be talking about again later, Rome was an empire before it was ever an empire. And it's beginning this imperial expansion of the hegemonic control of Rome that is beginning at this time of the death of Alexander. Now, even at the time that Rome is expanding, and even at the height of its empire, Rome was not the largest empire in the world, nor was it the largest empire that had ever been. The Persian Empire was larger than Rome, but that dates back, to I think 585 BCE. No, that's the Iranian Empire. The Persian Empire is 500 BCE. So it's the early when Rome was not an empire at all in either definition. There is then, though, at the time of Rome, the Xiongnu Empire in China, which was the largest empire of the ancient world in China. There was the Achaemenian, which was the Persian Empire, and then there were the Chinese Empire, other Chinese and Iranian empires. But the point is that Rome had an overwhelming impact, and in so many ways is still with us, and has influenced the development of the West ever since. And we'll see how this is so. And in so many ways we could claim, depending again on definitions, that Rome actually was the largest empire in the ancient world, and almost until today when we see in later lectures, not today, but in later lectures, next lecture and thereafter, when we couple that with Christianity. Now, that's getting ahead of ourselves. And we'll be talking about the rise of Christianity, I believe, next lecture. I'll be talking about the so-called fall of Rome in a couple weeks, I think it is. Not this week or not, but next week or the week after. Because the question will be really, does Rome ever fall? Just as an example in terms of the impact of Rome. If I stood before you and said, Heil Hitler, you would know what that was about. The Nazi salute. Hey, Hitler, Heil Hitler. Do you know how the American Pledge of Allegiance originally was to be said? It was originally to be said as, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. It was only when the Nazis started doing their salute, Heil Hitler, that the Americans said, oh my God, we can't do that. That's Nazis. We're against Nazis. So we can't say the Pledge of Allegiance this way anymore. We'll say it with our hand over our heart. That was a big change. Now, what is it? That's not a Nazi development. I mean, it was, but that's the imperial salute. That's the Roman imperial salute. Hail Caesar. Heil Hitler. We'll see how that goes along. What was the symbol of the Roman Empire? The eagle. What was the symbol of the Nazis and the German empires? The eagle. What was the symbol of America? The eagle. And if only Benjamin Franklin could have won out and we had the turkey as our national bird, things might have been different, but we didn't. We chose the eagle, imperial. So the impact of the idea of Rome has had a far greater significance for the development of the West in so many ways than actually the political development of Rome. Even though that idea of Rome, or what I'll be talking about, the myth of Rome, was based on the political. So we're going to look at some of these developments. And this lecture is not going to be the entire history of the Roman Empire from its origins of Rome all the way to its quote-unquote fall whatsoever. We'll see that in time as we go through the next several lectures, which is we'll still be dealing with the Roman Empire. But this lecture is going to look at the origins and the development of the empire, both geographically in terms of the hegemonic control and in terms of the imperial form of government, which we'll get there when we get there. So I hope that kind of puts this in perspective in terms of where we're going and what we're looking at, in terms of the myth of Rome, which I'll hope we'll give more content to, because that is a central concept and becomes central for the myth of the West, which is really the myth of Western civilization, which is what this course is all about. That being said, we can then move on from the introductory part to the origins of the Republic, because before the form of government of empire, imperial form of government in Rome emerged, it was originally a republic, but even before the republic, it was a kingdom. Now, here's just a brief overview of the Roman timeline. And Villanovan culture, which I'll talk about very briefly shortly, Etruscans and then kings overthrown. And this is not something that you're going to need to memorize or anything. It's just kind of an overview. Because by 264 BCE, Rome was controlling central Italy, and basically the Italian peninsula keeps on expanding. So this is just kind of to help put it all in perspective, because too, if we have the origins of the Republic in 509 BCE up there, and then we had the last Roman emperor in the West in 476 CE, it's 1,000 years. The extent of let's say the staying power of Rome is too been quite an impressive aspect of the Roman Empire, depending on how it's defined. So let's start at the beginning, and that is with the origins of the Roman Republic, the Etruscans and early Romans. I had mentioned up there in the timeline the Villanovan culture. We're looking at here geographically the Italian peninsula. There was no such thing as Italy. And the Italian peninsula, as most of early geographical territories, was inhabited by various tribes of people. And the Villanovan culture, as archaeologists and historians have put forward, some of the earliest evidence for cultural activity in the Italian peninsula. The relationship between the Villanovan culture, which we know very little about because the sources are not excellent. There are not enough artifacts from the Villanovan culture to be able to say much about it. But we know a little bit more with the Etruscans. The Etruscans kind of developed out of Villanovan culture, so to speak. And the Etruscans were a very important tribe. I'll be saying more about the Etruscans later because in some ways Rome was founded by the fusion of the Etruscans and the Latins. The Latins were also a tribe. And once we have this fusion of the Etruscans and the Latins founding Rome, coming to Rome and establishing settlements in Rome, we have the beginnings of Rome. Now, what does this also mean? It means that there was no indigenous ethnic Romans. The original Romans that inhabited Rome were the fusion of the Etruscans and the Latins. They became kind of an ethnic identity. We talk about the Roman face and the Roman bone structures and things. But that was really the combination of the Etruscans and the Latins together. And we'll be talking more about the stories about that when we get there. But as in all ancient society, I mean, it's the earliest form of government in Rome was a king. According to myth or legend, or as it was considered, Rome was founded in 753 BCE. And that's how Rome dated their history, is from the origins of the city. And so this was in the year 200 and what would it be, 250, something like that. From the origins of the city, the republic was established because the kings worked well. They did so until 509 BCE, so for over 200 years. But then one of the last kings was a real tyrant, and a group of aristocrats, going back to Aristotle's different constitutions and Polybius' cycle of constitutions, overthrew the tyrant. They kicked out the king. They got rid of the king. The king was named Tarquin. And one of the leaders of Tarquin, the tyrant, the proud, was a man named Brutus. And Brutus was one of the leaders of the group that overthrew Tarquin. And Brutus is a name that we'll meet again. And yes, from the same family. Brutus was not his first name. Brutus is the family name. I just want to point that out. We'll come back to that. But they established a republic in 509 BCE. And that is really the beginnings of Rome. Now, originally, the Romans, even under the kings, we're talking about a rather small territory on the hills, the various hills of Rome, the 7 hills of Rome, as it's known as. These are farmers. These are farmers trying to make a living and defend themselves, working together. And they established this republic and figure out a way to govern themselves. There is something called the 12 Tables, which is a series of laws which arose later. It wasn't established at first in 509 BCE. I don't have off the top of my head right now the date of the actual tablets of the 12 Tables. But we're looking at traditional approaches to self-governance. And it's the rule of law. There's also, up here, I'm going to talk about the Constitution, because the Constitution to the Roman Constitution was not a written document. 12 Tables is a document, but the Roman Constitution, not like our Constitution, but it is a description of how things worked and developed, just to see the origins of the structures of Roman government and how they went about governing themselves. And it emerged over time and developed. So everything wasn't all in place in 509 BCE with the Republic. But this idea of a republic, basically a representative form of government, governing ourselves, was so central to the Roman view of themselves and what they were about and what they were doing. Based on law, we are society based on law. If we can say the Greeks were based on philosophy, the Romans were based on law, and the fusion of the two led to Roman Empire. But during the course from 509, the idea was that we need to, in some ways, continually expand. We can almost say that Rome had a policy of preemptive strikes, so to speak. It's like, okay, we're worried about our safety, the safety of our people, of our agriculture, of our farms, our land and territory. Wouldn't it be wiser then just to take more? And Rome starts expanding, and that just continues. And by the mid 3rd century, so like 80 years after the death of Alexander, Rome is in control of the Italian peninsula, basically. But we'll come back to that. Not a whole lot, because the details for me in this course are not that important. There are more details in the textbook. But we need to look at the structure of the Constitution, because I think you'll see a lot of similarities. We have this Constitution here. I have at the top of the slide, the Roman Constitution, consul/consul. And that's because the Romans, establishing the empire, felt there should be 2 executive leaders, like 2 presidents. The consul, in some ways, is like the president. But we have 2 of them, consul and consul. And these are leaders. These are leaders of the people, the political leaders, the chief executive officers, and leaders of the military. And this is going to be important too, because the consuls, by definition, had command. Today, our president still is referred to as the commander-in-chief. And command in Latin is imperium. I-M-P-I-R-I-U-M. I-M-P-E-R-I-U-M. Sorry. Imperium. Imperium is command, the ability to command troops. And we'll see later that this term can be used for generals, because a general would have command over the troops. So a general would be given imperium to go conquer a certain territory. But that imperium, that structure of command, culminated in the 2 consuls. So the idea was both have to agree on the military policy of the structure. Now, underneath the consuls was the Senate. And the Senate was actually the nobility, or the aristocracy, the nobility. It was not an elected office. It was an office by status and by nobility. It's the toga. The Roman toga signified that you were a member of the Senate. And the Senate, aside from the consuls, had the power. The Senate was also a judicial body. I'll be talking a little bit more about that when we're talking about Cicero, because major trials were held in the Senate. And the senators were the jury and judge over the major trials. Now, certainly not small trials, certainly not petty trials, but major trials were held in the Senate. The Senate had the authority to approve or not to approve policies of the consuls. They were also responsible for all financing and attributing financing to the consuls, to the military, and on we go. And that was really important. And again, the origins of all this, to keep in mind, these are farmers, these are citizens protecting what they consider to be their own territory. And that is important too, because that will change in time. In time, again, I forget exactly the explicit date, as Rome is growing, there began to be calls for representation in the government of the common people. And so were established assemblies, or the assembly, to provide a voice to the Senate, and therefore to the consuls, to other more common people. So we have the assembly, the Senate, the 2 consuls, oh my gosh, House of Representatives, the Senate, and the presidency, the executive. And we have then a number of other offices, the quaestor, praetor, censor, tribune, and aedile. The quaestor was in charge of the treasury, basically the treasurer for the state, working together with the censor, which I'll come back to in terms of taxes, and the quaestor was responsible for the treasury. The praetor was overseeing the military. I mean, could be um, um, partly generals themselves, but it also was an office of government. It could also be attributed to, or assigned other tasks and so. And so the praetor was a very important office for Rome. The censor was responsible for the census. They kept records, or tried to keep records, of how many people are we actually governing. And as that was expanding, that was an increasingly important office. We have the tribune, which was a representative of the people in the assemblies, and so the tribunate and all these things of the praetorate, the censorate, and the tribunate. And then the aedile was responsible for the public buildings and festivals. And then finally, there was the priesthood, the pontifices, which were the priests, and then the Pontifex Maximus, which was the chief priest. And this was part of the governing, because as Cicero, and I'll be talking a little bit more about Cicero later, asserted and affirmed that religion is a civic virtue. For the Romans, religion was essential. Now, they weren't kind of theocratic about it. I mean, you could worship whatever gods you kind of wanted. There were official Roman gods whom you had to at least acknowledge and pay tribute to. That was part of what religion actually meant. At least it's been theorized, religio, that which binds us to the gods. But the religious worship or religious festivals were organized, but you could also were perfectly free to have your own, let's say, worship practices or your own piety, have a special god to whom you called on, and everything else. In the Roman pantheon was simply the Greek pantheon romanized. And so Zeus in Greek became Jupiter, Aphrodite became Venus, and on we go. I'm not going to go through, it doesn't all that matter all that much, but it's an issue of adopting Greek religion, but adopting it to Roman practices. But that was seen as a governmental function to regulate. It's part of being a good citizen. And as we will see later on too in this lecture, it was part of being pious. Now, pious is a term that today, at least my sensitivities are, is not necessarily a positive term. I don't think there are not very many people who say, oh, yes, I'm pious. People might say, I'm religious. Yes, I'm religious. I'm a believer or whatever, or not. But of that group, there's a much smaller group that would say, I am pious. It's almost like this, piety. It's almost a falseness to it, in a general sense. Now, if you're someone who would say, I'm pious, you don't have that falseness connotations associated with it. It's a very positive meaning for you. And I'm not trying to say that that is a wrong use of it whatsoever, but what I'm trying to get at is that term, to understand what the Romans are meaning by it. We have to get back to the Roman understanding. That means you are a pious Roman, which means you show honor and respect to the gods, to the state, and to your family. Or to your family, to the state, and to the gods. That is kind of this threefold Trinitarian structure of Roman religion. All three have to be there, and that is the goal of what makes for a good Roman. It is a good citizen. You're contributing to the state by being pious, by respecting, protecting, defending, furthering the family, the state, the gods, all one together. So often, we have this, again, I mentioned it before, I think this concept of separation of church and state, but do we have separation of religion and state? I would argue absolutely not. And for Rome, it was kind of the same way. As long as you adhered to the basic practices of Roman religion, as organized and defined by the priesthood, the Pontifices and the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, it was pretty well open. And that's important. And that concept of Roman piety, in some ways analogous to with the Greeks, I didn't talk about this, but this idea of virtue, strength. There was this Greek ideal, and that also became an ideal for Rome, but it was an ideal that was inherent within being pious, pious, because you could not be pious if you weren't virtuous, if you weren't virtuous, strong strength, and that comes from man. Anyway, all kinds of fun things there that I'm not going to go into. I don't want to get sidetracked, but there's so many fun things here. But that's kind of the structure of the Constitution as it had developed throughout the growth of the Republic. Now, this is to the slide from Empire to Empire, the quote-unquote fall of the Republic, because as Rome was expanding on through the 3rd century and into the 2nd century BCE and into even the 1st century BCE, it was growing significantly. It had grown from this small group of farmers on Rome defending themselves to, by the middle of the 3rd century, controlling basically all of the Italian peninsula, expanded to North Africa with the Punic Wars, a series of wars against Carthage, and it was beginning to expand north of the Alps. This was becoming to be a monster in so many ways. I mean, in some ways, Rome was always at war. Rome was always at war based on this early kind of basic policy of it's better to protect ourselves than it is to wait around for someone to attack us. So we have to keep expanding. This is going to be very important because aren't there limits to expansion? So of course there are limits to expansion. But by the mid or early 1st century, so by the single digits BCE, there were real problems because all of a sudden, too, the population is so large. How do you govern? Now, Rome had a brilliant strategy. It was for growth. When they would conquer a territory, they would allow the people to follow their own beliefs and everything else. They would put governors in place to govern, like Roman officials and governments to kind of oversee, but then the local people could continue governing themselves. So it was not a heavy-handed administrative structure. It was more of, okay, we now rule this territory. We have hegemonic control over this territory. We'll put a Roman governor in here overseeing, but then you guys can work your own, do your own stuff. You don't have to, adopt all of Roman practices. But so as the empire is expanding, it's becoming increasingly diverse with different peoples governing themselves under the authority of a Roman governor and the provinces and on we go. And yet still Rome is expanding, and it starts to also expand citizenship. Being a Roman citizen was not just somebody who lived there. Citizenship is a privilege. It's not a right. We've kind of gotten away from that, and for us, a citizen almost means someone who is a legal resident of a given territory. This gets into other things, but in the International Declaration of Human Rights, International Declaration of Human Rights, how was I talking about in 114? One of the basic human rights defined in that document was the right to citizenship. That is such a modern concept. And for Rome, there's no right to citizenship. To be a citizen means you are a propertied male member of the city, inhabitant of the city, who is fighting for the city. citizen farmers, citizen armies. Citizen armies. These are farmers fighting for themselves, defending their property, which is more than just the land. But as it's expanding, they need more people. They need to expand their military too, to not only keep fighting, but to expand the territory. And so they become more professionalized. They start having to develop means of professionalizing the military. So it's not just the citizens. We'll pay people to fight for us. And then, okay, shouldn't we give people who are fighting for us citizenship? That is a big question. And that just keeps going and going and going. I'll be talking more about that in the so-called Fall of Rome lecture. So it's becoming really a problem. And there begins to be social tensions and upsetness. There is, let's say, peasants. It's not peasants, just commoners. And led by the tribunes, the representatives of the common people, or the populo minuto, as they were called later in Italy in the Renaissance. But the plebeians, the plebs, plebeian just means people, not nobles. The Senate, or aristocrats, the Senate are not plebeian, but plebeian just means the common people. And there were a series of uprisings and discussions and problems, and led by the Gracchi especially, until finally the general and consul Sulla marches on Rome in 88 BCE. Now, how does he do that? He does that because part of the provisions of the Constitution, with the two consuls and the Senate kind of ruling as altogether, so the Senate consul, was when there is chaos, when there is an emergency, a single person can take command, imperium, and establish order. That person will be a dictator. Dictator simply means one who speaks. A dictator has the ability and authority to speak, and what the dictator says happens. It is almost like with the presidency in a time of war, has heightened executive powers. Not completely, but certainly more than in peace times. We talk about military law, establishment of military law, and that there are mechanisms for the president, if the president really deemed it necessary, to establish his own kind of, let's say, dictatorial power, analogous to the Roman Constitution, where it is by the Constitution itself that in times of immense crises, a single dictator or dictator can establish imperium, command over all of the empire, to restore order. And that is what Sulla did. He takes his troops and marches on Rome. We need to put this in order. And he does. He quells the dissent. He puts it down. He reestablishes peace and order. And then he says, okay, I'm done. I'm going to go back to being a general, and good luck with everything. Order's been reestablished. I'm no longer dictator. Power's back in the Senate and the consuls. This was really important for what was coming, because this is a case of the emergency provisions, let's say, of a dictator, a dictator establishing himself with imperium, working the way it was designed to work. Also, I mean, just think about it for us, and this is very much the case, in a time of war, when decisions need to be made very quickly, the president has the right to do that. Generals on the field may say, Mr. President, we want to bomb these people. Can we do it? And the president will say, okay, you can do it. Think about the problems if the president would have to then take that to Congress, or actually if there are two consuls to take that to Congress and then say, can we have the authority to do all this? And it's like, well, let's debate it. Romans were great debaters. There's always going to be a diversity of opinions. Opportunity gone missed. That is just the example of why being a dictator is a valid need at times. So if the president, as commander-in-chief, dictates, bomb them. It can be bombed. It doesn't have to wait for the approval of Congress, even though war has to be declared by Congress in our country officially. Last declared war was World War II. Last official war. So that's the only point I'm making this is the title of dictator is someone who has imperium, command, to deal with a crisis. And Sulla did that and then went back to normal, let's say. But that wasn't going to last for very long because the situation with Rome, as it continues to expand and all of these problems are getting out of hand. I mean, Rome had grown by this time of extent. It had crossed the Alps. It had gone into what we call Europe today. It hadn't quite gotten to Britain yet, but it was getting very close. And on the east, it had gotten very far east into nearing India, not quite there yet either, but certainly with Greece and throughout the territories near the Persian Empire borders. And all of the peninsula. So it is this empire as a republic, still a republic, the Roman Republic, but it had hegemonic control over this expansive territory of very diverse peoples. And how to hold it all together is a problem. And that brings us to Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was a Roman general. I'm sure you know about Caesar, at least a fair amount about Caesar. Or in Latin, Julius Caesar. Because in classical Latin, a C is pronounced as a hard C or like a K. A-E is an I. S is like an S or a Z. And so it's Caesar. It's Caesar. Is a more medieval pronunciation. Ecclesiastical Latin would be Caesar would be the ecclesiastical Latin pronunciation, and then in English becomes Caesar. A Roman general with imperium north of the Alps. And Caesar feels, there's still chaos in Rome. There had been a group of three to establish who would be the first triumvirate, who could take over and rule the chaos. Instead of having a dictator, let's have this triumvirate of three people. But Caesar felt this really isn't working. I need to go and establish order, just as Sulla had done. And in 49 BCE, Julius Caesar, with his troops, crosses the Rubicon, this iconic river, and becomes the statement to cross the Rubicon. Oh my gosh, the point of no return, no going back. Caesar crosses the Rubicon with his troops, invades Rome, and establishes himself as dictator. Sulla had done the same. So here, Caesar as dictator had imperium over what was going on, had command. The problem was Caesar didn't relinquish power once order had been established. He remained as dictator, and that upset a lot of people. Now, my apologies, but right now I need to take a short break. So this will be week 3, lecture 2, part 1, and I'll be back shortly to finish. Again, my apologies for this, but we'll make it anyway. Thanks so much, and I'll be back right away. Bye-bye.